Prynawn pawb, cyfarsion o Brydain. Now, I know that Erin said that the language of this conference is English, but we are multinational, so I thought I would just throw in a little bit of Welsh. That means good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Turf Island. And one of the reasons I did that was because this paper is all about translating, in this particular case between Russian and English, and I have to acknowledge the tremendous contribution of my friend and colleague, Dr. Margarita Weisman, who unfortunately can't be with us in Canada today, but is hopefully somewhere online and will be available to answer questions afterwards, because if you try asking me questions about the Russian language, I will not have a clue. So, translating the Cavalry Maiden. If you were here 2 years ago, you may remember that Margarita and I did an online presentation giving the basic outline of the life of Aleksandr Aleksandrov. Today we're going to get a little more into the weeds, as it were, on which key do I need? Page down, perhaps? No? Okay.
Are you just trying to advance it? Just touch that.
That one.
It'll move. Should if it's set up.
Nope.
No. Supposed to.
Okay. So which one do I hit again?
Just the arrow keys.
That one. Right. Okay, so a brief summary for those of you who weren't here 2 years ago. Aleksandr Aleksandrov is a person of joint Russian-Ukrainian ancestry. His mother was Ukrainian, his father Russian, and as a very young person in his 20s, he ran away and joined the Russian army to fight against Napoleon. He became a war hero and was awarded the Cross of St. George by Tsar Aleksandr I. He's also given the right to use the surname Aleksandrov to showcase his personal connection to the Tsar. His gender identity was, at the time, known both to the Tsar and to senior officers, including Marshal Kutuzov, on whose staff he served at the Battle of Borodino. But they were perfectly happy to accept him as a male officer in the army because he was doing the job of a male officer in the army. When the war was over, Aleksandrov wrote a memoir. And it turned out that his brother had become friendly with Alexander Pushkin, the romantic poet, editor, publisher, etc., famous Russian literary figure, which some of you may have heard of. And Pushkin was keen to publish the memoir. But he and Aleksandrov disagreed quite seriously over the marketing strategy. Pushkin very much wanted to push the angle of brave, beautiful young woman disguises herself as a man to help save her country. And Aleksandrov was quite insistent that he was now a man and he wanted to be treated as such. So you can see some of the evidence on that photograph of an early copy of the memoir. The word at the top, Aleksandrova, that's actually a genitive, so it means of Aleksandrov or by Aleksandrov. But lurking down the bottom is Aleksandrov's dead name. So the book was actually published under the dead name by Pushkin. The book has since become a mainstay of the memoir canon in Russian literature, but of course, again, under the dead name. And Aleksandrov also wrote many works of fiction, which I hope will see the light of day at some point. In 1988, we had our first translation of the book into English. There are now 2 translations, but I'm going to focus on the better known one, which is by Mary Fleming Zirin. And this book, the English version, has become a mainstay of women's studies in Slavic studies and comparative literature. Aleksandrov has become a feminist heroine, being a so-called example of early women's writing. The book has also been translated into French, German and Italian, and I would love to speak to somebody who has good command of those languages that can tell me how the translation has been done. What I can say is that in the English translation, Aleksandrov's trans identity has largely been erased. And we can note, for example, the use of the author's dead name on the cover of the book. Now, Russian is a highly gendered language, and those of you who speak French or Spanish or Welsh might be familiar with the problems. I have no idea what it is in Thai, I'm afraid, so you'll have to tell me afterwards. But because it's a gendered language, Aleksandrov was able to do all sorts of interesting things. The title of the book in Russian is Kavalerist Devitsa. A kavalerist is a masculine noun, meaning a cavalry officer, and devitsa is a feminine noun, meaning a maiden. And by combining the two, Aleksandrov has created a word which is both masculine and feminine. So the title of the book, if you're a Russian reader, is already asking interesting questions about gender. And also, because of the way that Russian grammar works, you have this combined noun which is both masculine and feminine, and that can be used with verbs and adjectives which are both masculine and feminine. Now that again is useful for complicating the narrative, and all this gets lost in English, which is a much less gendered language. Something else that Aleksandrov does, which again is occasionally lost in the translation, is that the narrator and the subject are separate people. The narrator is narrated by somebody who is gendered as... the book is narrated by somebody who is gendered as female, but the subject of the memoir is gendered as male, and yet we are somehow expected to believe that these two are the same person. So there's a lot of gender complication going on in the narrative. Now, in any exercise in translation, the choice of words matters, that you can change the meaning of a translation from the original by picking words which appear to mean almost the right thing, but do not actually reflect what the original book intended. And Aleksandrov uses gendered ambiguity in Russian to complicate the narrative, but Mary Zurin's translation corrects, with these big scare quotes, this to allow for a more consistently feminine presentation. And the best example of that is the use of the word muzhetstvo, which means manly courage. And you can think of that as being like the Spanish word macho. You wouldn't use macho to talk about a woman unless perhaps you were talking about a butch lesbian. And yet Aleksandrov uses muzhetstvo to talk about himself, and the translation by Mary Zurin is courage, which is a word which is not gendered in any way. So that's erasing the masculine presentation of the author. Now, I'm delighted that we now have a wealth of other evidence of Aleksandrov's masculine self-identity. After the war, he spent a little bit of time in St. Petersburg, which was not at all comfortable for him. And he then went to live in a country town called Elbuga, and he spent the rest of his life there. In total, he spent 60 of his 83 years living as a man. How can we say that with confidence? Because we have evidence. In the latter half of the 19th century, Russians became obsessed with their great victory over Napoleon, and historians of the time were keen to talk to people who had been part of that famous campaign. So a couple of Russian historians, and this is about Victorian era in Western time, they went to look for people who had experience of the war, and they went to the town where Aleksandrov had lived out the end of his life and talked to people who had known him. And both the historians and many of the witnesses were quite positive and sympathetic about Aleksandrov's identity. We also have copies of some of his business correspondence in which he consistently uses male pronouns for himself. So that's a pretty clear statement of gender identity. Now here's one extract from one of the historical papers from a Mr. Lashmanov. To the day she died, Durova could not bear to be called by her existing female name, so I will herein refer to her by the name given to her, or rather authorized by the Emperor Aleksandr I in 1807. So, although he's using female pronouns, he's happy to use the name that Aleksandrov wanted used for himself. Here's the other example from Mr. Kutscher. Durova always considered herself to be a man, wore male clothing, aspired to imitate male manner, voice and gait, and did not permit herself to be addressed otherwise. In fact, she would become quite angry if anybody addressed her in any way that suggested she might be female. So we have here pretty clear evidence from two independent historians and some people who knew Aleksandrov that he had a very solid male gender identity. And if you remember the talk that Jameson and Dallas gave, where they were talking about the difficulty of knowing how people from the past identified, here we have pretty clear evidence of somebody expressing what we would now understand as a trans identity. Now, those two papers by the two historians are now available in English translation. That was done by Margarita and some of her students. I just did the sensitivity read for that, and there was very little really required. And they are now available on the Notches LGBT history blog, thanks to my good Canadian friend Justin Bangry. So there's the web address if anybody wants to look them up. I believe they will also eventually be appearing in the journal Slavic Studies. Now, just before I leave this, I want to give a couple of caveats about cultural context, because we can't necessarily fit Aleksandrov neatly into the Western conception of a trans man. The first point to bear in mind is that Russian society in the 19th century was very strongly hierarchical. And because he was living in a country town rather than in Moscow or St. Petersburg, which were much more westernized and much wealthier, Aleksandrov pretty much outranked everybody else in the town. And therefore, they would have been showing deference to him as a social superior and might have been unwilling to risk his ire by not accepting him as a man. It's also true that Russia, at the time and now, is a very multicultural society. I believe I'm right in saying that the area where Aleksandrov lived was annexed by Ivan the Terrible, but maybe Margarita will correct me on that. But the town of Sarapul, where he was born, and Elabuga, where he lived out the rest of his life, are in colonized parts of Russia, which have sizable indigenous populations who speak Uraic and Turkic. And we don't yet have a good handle on what the cultural attitudes of those people are to gender variance. What I can say is that area 2,000 years ago was the area controlled by the Scythians, and we have it on good authority from Herodotus that they had trans women amongst their society. So, you know, there may well be other issues going on that would have caused the people in those towns to be more accepting of somebody with a gender diverse identity. So, just as a brief conclusion, translating trans autobiographies requires knowledge of not just the language, but conventions around the linguistic use of gender and of the cultural context in which the work was written. Poorly informed translations can easily mislead. And if you're interested in reading more about this, Margarita and I have a paper that will hopefully be appearing in Trans Studies Quarterly, either later this year or early next year, obviously dependent on whatever is happening in the USA, which is a bit mad, but there you go. So, that's me done. Thank you very much.